This is called The Proof of an Advanced Civilization, Learning from History, Part 8. I couldn't have done this Part 1, but now I feel I can put enough information together to give you details of so many individual things that on their own wouldn't stand up, but when they're linked together, one can see the importance and the relevance of the statement that we are the product of an advanced civilization. Voltaire, one of the great historians and wise men in France, said history is the lie currently agreed upon. This is one of the interesting facts of modern genetics, and that is that these three young men from all around the world, as you can see, have a common M158 marker on the Y chromosome at 50,000 BC. That should tell us something about how closely related we all are, all of us on this planet, including the Aborigines. And we've also realized too, with all the work done on the human genome, that the first and second chromosomes on our species are fused. And we're told by the experts that that fusing process is something that does not appear in nature. It is not a mutation. It can only happen deliberately. So that raises a lot of interesting questions. I'm not going to answer them here. I just want you to hang on to that particular point because it's very important about which species we are, who we're developed from, etc. But essentially, for most people's purposes, there shouldn't be any issues about race because we're all one happy family, or should be, with no real differences at all. And if we can recognize the good features of other people rather than the bad features, then we can all make more progress. This is the concept of diffusion from Africa, out of Africa, about within the last 50,000 years, which is within that genetic research. But we may have an earlier migration this way. It could have come that way, but around the coastlines, taking people into Australia, and with much lower sea levels and land rises, it would have been quite straightforward in about 60,000, 70,000 years BC for people to cross over into Australia by a land route. And although the people who are specialists and Aborigines say that they would not have survived in Australia unless it had been a really big colonization and properly organized. That's an interesting point from the anthropologists. This is the other, a little bit later, 37,500 BC, with what we call the Aurignacian Homo sapiens sites, which you can see here right the way from Iran, Kurdistan, the various routes, the Levant here being a key part of the process as a route, and this is where we find really interesting remains of people. That's just a little bit of background on where our ancestors came from. At 100,000 BC on the left, you'll see the kind of tools which existed, and they were clearly tools chipped by a more primitive man than ourselves. And then we look at the right-hand side and we see the peak perfection of flint tools and implements, which reached a peak in 24,000 BC with the Civilisation people and have never been improved upon. Nothing like it has ever been done since then. And those tools and that technology was taken around the Atlantic, around the world, in fact, in very early times by people in wooden-framed or skin boats. That is just a little example of a later flint. We had the Clovis flints, and then we had the Fulsum, and the gap between Clovis and Fulsum was this great catastrophe, which wiped nearly everybody out. And then we have these kind of flints, and this isn't Thebes in Egypt, it's Thebes on the Missouri River in southern Illinois, that particular flint, at about 6,750 BC. That's the kind of artwork our ancestors produced about 18,000 BC. Takes a bit of beating, I think. It's one of the Matari cave paintings. It's very difficult to get in and see them. They're worried about disappearing with too many people coming in and the atmosphere changing, etc. Believe it or not, that is a beautiful carving of a horse. Same period, difficult to date, I think, but the Magdalenian peoples ranged from Portugal to Poland. And at Lascaux, horses predominate with 364 images of horses, by far the largest species carved, and images of horses with harnesses. Horses were being ridden at these very early dates, contrary to what you are told by archaeologists and historians. This is a key chart to look at the past, because our past has been very much affected by a supernova explosion at 39,000 BC and all the stages of debris and waves and shock, and eventually the large lumps of rock and the total disruption of our solar system by debris, final lumps of that debris blasting through our solar system at 10,900, which resulted in the axis shifting and multiple impacts, causing what is considered to be the biggest mass extinction of animals and life for 3.7 million years. The first signs we have of people saying anything are these legends from the American Indians, South American Indians, Caribbean. And it's the Arawak Caribbean tribe warning a fire from the sky. But there was a creator God. There was somebody who said to the Indians, go dig a large pit, cover it with logs, and pile sand over the top. After it is done, seal yourselves up inside the pit for protection. The Creator sent a terrible rain of fire and hail down from the sky to destroy the world. The family began to fear that the pit was not deep enough to protect them, but soon the noise stopped and the roof of the pit grew cooler to touch. Some animals and a few other people survived to rebuild the world. This is a common thread in at least 20 different records from different species or tribes around the planet. It's a common story, very important. And they all refer to somebody who they regarded as a creator God who was able to tell them that problems were coming. One of the best pieces of evidence we have that there was some civilized thinking going on at these very dates, which is prior to 10,900. That's what happened, just a visualization of one of the impacts, apart from all the other massive disruption caused at that time, which I've dealt with in other lectures. That's an example of a mini one at Tugunska, which wiped out an area the size of Belgium and left it in that condition for many years. It took a long while for things to grow back after that burst of a meteorite over the Tugunska area. Key book, key research, pulling a lot of information together by John Gagnon, a Canadian, an independent researcher who looked at all the scientific evidence and produced a marvelous document. John's key point was that the Earth was tipped on its axis. Even Enoch talks about this. There's lots of evidence for this. And if you can visualize this area here, that was where the ice was. And we now have it moved downwards, you can see, by impact and twisting and torque from a large object that came by. That might well have been Venus before it relocated itself. But it's very easy to see here that if we suddenly have all the ice moved, then we have a very rapid melting process at some point in time, although we had in what was called the Younger Dryas, that because of the catastrophe, there was massive disruption and dust in the air, and we went into what is called a snowball Earth, coldest period for many, many thousands of years during this Younger Dryas. Now, John has done his homework very well, in my opinion, and other people have confirmed this, but the people who built the Great Pyramid, which came much later, 2,450, they recorded the star shafts from the King's Chamber actually went to the key north and south pole stars at that time, Alpha Draconis, and of course 3 stars in the Orion's belt, and Zeta Orionis. The reason the pyramids are offset in that way, along with other structures around the planet, is because it was to focus people's attention on Orion's belt, Zeta Orionis, a very important star. And that message is encoded in the Great Pyramid for where those pole stars were when the Great Pyramid was built. But in addition to that, the Queen's Chamber shafts point to those same key stars, as viewed at 2 degrees latitude. There's a little bit of complexity and adjustment here, which you can really look at in the book. But the point I'm making here is that this was the alignment at 10,900, before the Earth was tipped on the axis. So the people who built the Great Pyramid, we know how clever they were with the precision in building the Great Pyramid, but they also passed the message of that terrible, catastrophic event at 10,900 onto us. many of these structures we look at on the ground are giving us messages of many different kinds, which we must really look at and realize that sophisticated people are trying to pass messages on to us, in particular, how fragile our Earth is from cometary debris. The 10,900 event, did we only have the Earth moving on its axis, but we had massive movements of the land on the Earth's surface. Very difficult to realize, but the geologists are talking about a 50-mile vertical movement off New Zealand, and many of the structures we see, like the Great Rift Valley, all being created over a very short period of time. And other ancient sites here actually recording the location of what was called the Hudson Bay Pole, because that's where the North Pole was in the Hudson Bay area before the Earth being tipped on its axis. There you have those two key sites, Teotihuacan and Tiwanaku on the boundaries of Bolivia and Peru, and you have these alignments to the Hudson Bay Pole, which are more clues, and there's lots more to follow on from this, and many other messages left for us within the pyramid as analysed by John Gagnon. This is Robert Temple's comments, and Robert Temple is one of the great researchers and produce some marvelous material. And he says this, the Great Pyramid was so perfectly orientated to the geographical points of the compass that no one has ever been able to understand how this was done. The extreme accuracy of the construction of the Great Pyramid, the great pavement upon which the Great Pyramid partially rests and which surrounds it, is flat to within 15 millimeters. The casing stone sides of the structure have been compared in their precision to the mirror of the Mount Palomar telescope. No doubts of the sophistication, no doubts of advanced knowledge being required, and remember all the pyramids, virtually all the pyramids on the planet are all perfectly aligned north, east, south and west. And they had to have that incredible knowledge of observational astronomy, which Nick Mann was talking about yesterday, to be able to get this kind of precision accuracy. Those are the Giza pyramids. I show the causeways here and the mastobars all round, and I've already talked about in previous lecture in Learning from History Part 5 that these pyramids were not built for dead people, nor were the mastobars, nor were the great structures, the valley temples, the structures at Saqqara, etc., and the new ones found at Hierakonpolis, 3800 BC. People were taking cover from this cometary debris problem. And these pyramids were built in 100 years before another great catastrophe came along. And I'm certain that they thought it could be as bad as the last one, and they took all these precautions. Though we're now finding there are loads and loads of tunnels and structures underneath these places for people to go, and perhaps most important, water storage while people were holed up in these structures for maybe 2 or 3 months. And the boats were there so that if the sea levels moved and the land moved as they did last time, they had a boat to get around with as well. And we're going to look at that boat a bit later. The mastobars are very interesting because they clearly were structures to, rather like Anderson shelters, very sophisticated Anderson shelters. They come in lots of many different types of form. And it looks as though some of these shafts were put in afterwards for burying people, although my suggestion, which I want to leave with you, is that people would have need access to water. Water was the one thing. If they got dried food, they have water, they could last for months on a very small diet. And water is the key thing that we need, plenty of fresh water at home in case we have similar problems in the future. And so I believe that that looks to me very much more like a well structure that people can go down on ladders to get water than anything else, although they may have been used later and dug later to bury people. But the jury's out on that, and the research really hasn't been done, but I think there's enough evidence to show that these structures, many of them enclosing loads of food storage, all sorts of interesting things, they were there to provide the supplies and the space for people to take cover, and individual families, if they were wealthy enough, would have built these for their own families, on maybe their own staff and servants, etc. And so that they could get as many people as possible under cover in that great pyramid complex, massive complex. And one of the keys to this is the Abu Hawash pyramid, which I've talked about before, which had a massive area inside, which with timber floors and roofs inside, structures, ladders, they would have got an enormous number of people in. And even the Great Pyramid of the Sun in Mexico, they've now found a massive cavern at the middle of the pyramid. And the Saqqara, which is the step pyramid, the first one built, has over 5 kilometers of tunnels underneath and all sorts of facilities for storing water and food. It is, in my opinion, utter nonsense to talk about the pyramids, all that effort being put into something for dead people, when that wasn't an Egyptian tradition, and where I believe that they thought there was another wipeout happening. It wasn't as bad as they thought, but it did end the golden age of the Bronze Age and the city-states. So it was a major turning point in our history. This is what the geologists are telling us about now. Up on the left here, you'll see Spain and land all the way from Spain to the Azores, the continental shelf around Britain, a great big sea in the middle of Africa. You'll see water from the Black Sea right the way across to Siberia, big sea in China, a quite different structure of the Earth before the great catastrophe. It just seems unbelievable that this could happen. But we know, in fact, although sea levels have risen by 450 feet, we know that the movements of the surface of the Earth's crust is moving now, and clearly has moved at massive vertical distances and sideways differences over that period, very short period. That is a little example of, I call it the Atlantis Ocean, because you can see very clearly where the Azores are, what would have been a large area of land above sea level. And that is the existing maps. But you've got a very large area which many people believe sank, which is adjoining the coast of Britain right the way through France, Africa, and you can see all the volcanic remains sticking up out of the water with those islands right the way down to the Cape Verde Islands, in fact, which gives us a clue that that area was, in fact, an area which sank. We have the story of Atlantis with elephants being on Atlantis, which is where the Azores are there. That's explained with this connection back to Africa, which we can see here. Much more will be done. We'll learn a lot more, I'm sure, and what is amazing is how far we're moving with our knowledge of the Earth's crust and the major movements which have taken place, particularly at the point of this particular catastrophe. As I say, 10,900. Another example, this is the land surface prior to overturn at Lauterbrunnen in Switzerland. Anybody been to Wengen skiing, you'll see this extraordinary drop. The geologists look at this and say, well, that's a massive faulting operation, which we believe took place at the same time as the catastrophe, along with the Rift Valley movements, etc., etc. Staggering. Now, Axis shift is followed by more than 1,000 years of ice age conditions globally, called the Younger Dryas. And then the planet starts to warm up again around 9,500. And at the same time, from that temperature chart I showed you, we began to get stability. And so after the big lumps of supernova debris had done all the damage they were going to do, there wasn't much else that was going to come in. And we had the stability of climate and temperature regularity rather than wild swings. Here we have the island of Atlantis as per the Cardiff University data. I arranged to get this done by a firm that has crossed the road from me to produce a visualization. If you go onto the Golden Age Project website, you can play with it at your heart's content and see that an island just as described by Plato is there, with a great plain, as a safe anchorage to the south, protected from the north winds and cold weather by that bow, as they called it, of mountains and high ground. And on the left, we have the actual Southampton University map showing the Azores Islands there in yellow and the whole structure. And Christian O'Brien made this discovery in 1983, and it's in the book called The Shining Ones. There's lots on the website about it. I put this in because we have the story of Bimini, and you'll see Bimini here, North Bimini and South Bimini here, and you'll also find them here. Well, it's off the coast of Florida, and these great stones, clearly, which you can see there, those great stones, which which people talk about as being Atlantis, but it's perfectly clear they would have been a place for ships to tie up and maybe a lot of trade to take place when that area was above sea level. The moment it's below sea level, but that area, which you can see very clearly of the Grand Bahama Bank, was above sea level, and the Bimini fits in very well for a place where ships could have traded. So what we're looking at is maybe the evidence of a much earlier civilization which was trading with the Grand Bahamas, Bimini, to the American coast in much earlier times. That is another map of the Gulf of Mexico, and you can see, anybody who's done geography knows, you can see where the Grand Bahama Banks are, and you can see the areas of land that would have been above sea level prior to the great catastrophe, or some idea of it. Don't worry about the square, that's from another map, and it relates to San Lorenzo, and that's the whole area where the Mayas and the early Mexicans and the Olmecs all had their great civilizations much, much later. Here we have a lovely image, a Maya image. This Mayan bas-relief shows a Mayan Noah escaping from a sinking island. Similar story, and it wasn't just Plato talked about Atlantis, it was many, many other people cross-referenced and checked the story that Plato told, including Crantor, and also the legends from both sides of the Atlantic and all over the world. Now, this is what Plato says, because Plato is the thinking man's philosopher even today, and I'm reading you the bold bits. You can fill in yourselves. This is about Solon talking to the great priest at Neath, which is Ninkarsag, the mother goddess, the Anu, Enil, and Enki, and Ninkarsag, four of them. She was the key lady and the governor of the Garden of Eden, which we're going to touch on later on. There have been and will be hereafter many and diverse destructions of mankind, the greatest by fire and water, though other lesser ones are due to countless other causes. And then further down, after the usual period of years, the torrents from heaven swept down like a pestilence, leaving only the rude and unlettered among you. Senior priest to Solon again, burnt up everything on the face of the earth and was himself consumed by a thunderbolt. This is Phaeton, the extraordinary story of Phaeton, who once harnessed his father's chariot. This is the way in which the god language was used for the astronomical signs and from the problems that were thrown at us from space. And the gods, of course, were responsible for all the problems we've had in the past. And a lot of people blame God for the problems we have now, but that's another story. To begin with, your people remember one deluge, though there were many earlier, and moreover, you do not know that the noblest and bravest race in the world once lived in your country. And the noblest and bravest race were the Aryans, and I'm going to use that word. The word means the noble ones, and we've covered up the word in several ways because it became unfashionable to talk about Aryans following Hitler's hijacking of the story for his own political ends. What must be remembered is that the archaeology in Germany in the 1880s, 1890s, 1900 was the best in the world, and the best information was provided by a whole range of archaeologists. And so the story was very well researched, but the word Aryan means the noble ones. And they're, in my opinion, totally benevolent people, and it's a great tragedy that the name has got such a bad connotation in modern terms. Plato's dialogue again, this is about the gods. Each gladly received his just allocation, settled his territories, and having done so, they proceeded to look after us, their creatures and children, as shepherds look after their flocks. They brought their influence to bear on the creature's most sensitive part, using persuasion as a steersman uses the helm, to direct the mind as they saw fit, and so guide the whole moral creature. The various gods then administered the various regions which have been allotted to them. So we have actually a very good glowing references for the gods, and you're going to see other ways in which they were honoured and appreciated by all the civilizations right the way up to Hadrian. And this is again the same story, but I'm going to just read out the last bit. For an interest in the past and historical research came only when communities had leisure and when men were already provided with the necessities of life. That is how the names, but not the achievements of these early generations came to be preserved. Modern science, led by astrophysicists and geologists, have clarified the accuracy of these statements and identified dates, details and causes of these diverse destructions, including the virtual wipeout of most species at the end of the Ice Age around 10,900 BC, and the destruction of the Bronze Age city-states from the Mediterranean to China, centering around the tree ring date of 2345. That's about 100 years after the Great Pyramids were all built in a big rush, something like 80 of them, and we saw all the henges and major constructions of chambered tombs throughout Europe. They knew something was coming. Both these dates are huge turning points in the history of our species, the first requiring a complete restart of agriculture and civilization in southern Lebanon by a small advanced group of catastrophe survivors, known later as gods, at the end of a younger Dryas, when things began to warm. The second requiring the survivors to re-establish the golden age of social organization through the city-states, originally delivered by these gods, but which in reality did not widely recover to our cost. Charles Rollin, wonderful man who went to a Catholic school, went to a Catholic monastery, and passed all the exams, was so good at his academic work and his knowledge that he ended up by being head of the senior academic at the University of Paris, and he was somewhere around about 1700. And he produced 5 volumes of ancient history, which I recommend everybody to read, because it tells you how the ancient world worked and their social organization and the way in which education operated. Lots of fantastic things which we need to relearn and re-establish today. And he summarizes his key point in the foreword of those books. And he says this: "We there discover and trace, as it were with the eye, the origin and progress, and perceive with admiration that the nearer we approach those countries which were once inhabited by the sons of Noah, the greater perfection we find the arts and sciences." In other words, we have to go back to the land of Noah in order to actually revive the arts and sciences. In other words, to go back to the source from whence they originally flowed. Very profound and important statement by one of the world's greatest historians. Land of Noah is this land of Canaan, lots of different names over a period of time. We normally think of it as the land of the Phoenicians, the red-haired ones, or the home of the noble paunch. But let's begin to look at some of the technology now. And this is light amplification in glass, to produce a glass which amplifies light. The Masons carried this knowledge with them, and the Chartres Cathedral windows were built of light amplifying glass. Nobody today knows how that technology is done, but that is a technology which was available at that time. This is a gift from Egypt to the Lebanon, and it's in the National Museum of Lebanon. It's the hardest material almost known to man, which is obsidian, incredibly difficult to work, but they knew how to work it without even scratching it. And also they produced gold. And I'm not saying it was this gold, but much of the gold, or a lot of the gold that was found in the land of Canaan was pure gold. And to produce pure gold with no impurities, it has to be heated to 6,000 degrees centigrade. This is the letter, and this should have gone into Hapwood's maps of the ancient sea kings, and it was incredibly important. It's from John Dolphin, who was head of the United Kingdom Atomic Energy Authority, and he makes this point to Hapgood in a letter: "Pure gold has been found in articles attributed to the Phoenicians, and to obtain pure gold it is necessary to reach a temperature of 6,000 degrees. But this is another letter, and this is from Dolphin again. Very much many thanks for your letter of September the 14th, 1957, with reference to very high temperature. The figure of 6,000 degrees is correct." I'm particularly interested in what Mr. Mallory's comment on page 8 with regard to the use of powder metallurgy some 5,000 years ago. This would appear to me to be confirmation of my view that very advanced metallurgical processes were in use prior to that date. And anybody who's read Lawrence Gardner's work and the white powder gold work and research can now see the links and relevance and the solid evidence behind that technology in use at some 5,000 years ago. This is something I've used before. I'll use it again, no excuses. And this was taught, we were talking about the Eurogrit tablets yesterday with Prudence's lecture, and this is a lecture. This is a letter from a teacher to the son of a king at the royal school at Uruguay, round about 1800 BC. And we are told that the stars without number that we see in the heavens, each one the progeny, the inhabitants of heaven, will in their turn populate the heavens to time without end. And so the story goes that when a sun or star dies, it goes forth in a piercing flash of light after compressing upon itself until it can press no more, and flies apart in a myriad of particles, each one finding itself in a space wherein it can gather from the heavenly soil nourishment for its growth, and in due course make itself a world as our Lord Shamash has done. That is a perfect description of a black hole, and I sent this, in fact, to Stephen Hawking at Cambridge. I didn't get a reply, and it was at the time when he said, oh, black holes, I've changed my mind about black holes, things didn't disappear in them. You actually do get an end product from a black hole, and it's beautifully described here, and it was on the same page of describing how a compost heap works. Crossing the seas. Civilization, crossing the world, technology, we have to look at the seas and crossing the seas. It's a lovely story all of its own, and I'm going to do a short segment here to bring in a few points. What we have is Tyre and Sidon were the oldest cities in the world, as told to Alexander, before he completely demolished it and built the causeway up there and stole all the goods and wrecked the whole of that Phoenician economy. And Canaan was what the area was called way before, maybe 2000 BC. And they were the home of the noble paunch. And if you read the Vedas, it says very clearly that the noble paunch conquered the world. In other words, there was a world colonization of the people who live in the land of Canaan, and that's where we get all these Indo-European links of languages, same languages, all around the world from 6000 BC, if not before. That's the kind of Canaanite galley, just to give a bit of flavour of the boats and the seas and their competence. This is W.J. Perry, Professor of Comparative Religion at Manchester University, one of the great scholars of the 20s. And he says simply, this is the summary at the top, a broad survey of the mythological systems of people of all parts of the world reveals signs of a past order, of the existence of gods capable of wonderful feats. And at the bottom, I've said here, other interesting clues of these wonderful feats are widely dispersed within our historical records from the ancient books of Enoch, and Enoch is another name for Hermes or Thoth, to modern specialists such as Laird Scranton within the science of Dogon, where he demonstrates that advanced Egyptian scientific knowledge is still being passed down accurately from father to son, which is always the tradition of passing knowledge in those ancient times. These are the main ocean currents, and as you can see, that gives you a clue where if you get on a boat of some kind, the currents, and very often the winds as well, will take you where they want to go. So if we're looking at the Atlantic off Africa, 3 fishermen on the Cape Verde Islands got caught in the storm, couldn't get back home, ended up opposite the Amazon. The sort of thing that's happening all the time. And a man and his wife went rowing the same route, and he gave up and she finished the job off. And you'll see the same thread in all the other major oceans. If you know where the winds are and where the currents are, and you can read them, which the ancients did, then traveling around the world, even across the deep oceans, wasn't a problem. And they had maps. Here we have Northgild's comparison of the Ptolemy map, which is Egypt. The Ptolemies were famous for building Alexandria. They were the generals, or the line of generals from Alexander the Great. And Ptolemy Philadelphus was the man who produced the Septuagint Bible and also was involved in the building of the Pharos Lighthouse, which we're going to look at. But those were those early maps, that top one. But when we find out what the Phoenicians were using and the other sailors were using, they were using the Dulcart Portolano. Portolano means port to port. The port-to-port maps were thousands of years old and completely accurate, far more accurate than anything that came later. And the Pires Rey map was based on a port-to-port map. Here is the maps and the tracks of Hugh the Great was carved in stone in 1137. It is known to have been in use for an indefinite period before that. Like the Portolanos of the West, the real date of origin is unknown. A comparison of the river system shown on this map with that of a modern map of China shows a remarkable accuracy. And these are Professor Hapgood's words in Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings. It seems to me that the evidence of this map points to the existence in very ancient times of a worldwide civilization, the map makers of which mapped virtually the entire globe with a uniform general level of technology, with similar methods, equal knowledge of mathematics, and probably the same sorts of instruments. I regard this Chinese map as the capstone of the structure I have erected in this book. For me, it settles the question as to whether the ancient culture that penetrated Antarctica and originated all the ancient Western maps was indeed worldwide. And we were saying about Peter Watts's work yesterday and Tom Brooks's work, Christian O'Brien, Luigi Staccini, many others. We now have the solid scientific evidence that the world was mapped in great detail. We know how they did it, we know how their maps worked, and that is one of the best pieces of evidence we have of a very advanced civilization in ancient times. This particular boat was in kit form by the Great Pyramid. It's been reassembled, and I want you to look at the bottom image, which is the overhead view. It's the most beautiful structure, and I heard an expert saying that it was quite as good, as far as its technology was concerned, than the great tea clippers, like the Cutty Sark, I think in the 1830s, 1840s, which was a culmination of all the Western, if you like, sailing knowledge up to that time. But this was clearly a highly advanced craft. It looks a bit clumsy there, but if you actually look at the detail and how it worked, it was utterly brilliant. And it was 142 feet long. And clearly, you don't build that kind of technology where somebody's going to be buried. You put it where somebody's probably going to need a decent ship if the planet came to the same kind of level of catastrophe as it did in the past. This is the kind of boat that the Civilisation people producing those wonderful flints would have used in sailing around the world on a wooden frame. That's a wooden frame with seal skins, which are immensely strong. Walrus skin. The walrus skin was used for shields. The tusks were used for sword handles. They came all the way down to the coast of France, maybe into the Spanish coast in very early times. And of course, there's only a few walrus left now, but they were a tremendous resource. And the skins could be peeled to provide light sails, as well as massively strong structures that we see here. These are umiaks on the Alaskan coast. That is the level of technology used in the stitching, which would have been passed to the Eskimos by the Civilisation people very early times, but that is a stitched walrus skin seam on an umiak. And you can bet your bottom dollar that seam, which is the weak point of the whole ship, would have been the strongest part of it. And there they are racing. These are ocean-going, very, very competent, brilliant craft, which are raced in Alaska, or were raced in Alaska. I don't know whether they're still doing it, but that's 1915. That is a modern reconstruction of the barge on which Queen Hattusha shipped two huge obelisks weighing approximately 350 tons each down the Nile from Aswan to Karnak, based on a fragmentary relief at Deir al-Bahri in 1485 BC. We now know from what Peter was telling us yesterday that why the big obelisks were so important, because they used those as their clocks, their calendars, all sorts of other means of reckoners during the day. Very important. It also explains why we have a 1,250-ton pink granite obelisk still in the quarry at Aswan, and why they went to the trouble of building something so big, because the bigger the obelisk, the more accurate were their calculations, and they were really into accurate calculations, as we saw from Peter's work. This is a little trip to the Caribbean with Columbus. Columbus saw these canoes, and they were drawn on his visit, and Columbus saw a canoe 66 feet long, which could carry 150 people. Now, the secret of this was, of course, is to have the right kind of wood, and every carpenter knows you have the right kind of wood. Balsa floats, but it's much too fragile. But if you can have something that floats and is strong, then you've got this wonderful product, and that was only possible from the silk cotton tree, and there are very few of them left on the planet now. This is the kind of sophistication I've switched to here, because this was a very important staging point on the Indus Valley colony of the Sumerians, where the ships went down the Indus Valley to the port, Lothal, and right the way eventually across to Peru, from the coast of Asia, and then picking up on the route to Peru. And this is the kind of sophistication at 2400 BC, the same time as the pyramids were being built, and this is the main administrative building. not a temple, a tamon, administrative building, on this wonderful town of D'Oliveira, which has been very well excavated and recorded by the Indian Archaeological Organization. This is Lofal Docks at the mouth of the Indus River, and this is where you see a massive amount of trade coming from Suma, round the coast, off down to the Asia, to China, and across the Pacific to the Americas. Here we have what really was the great success in crossing the Pacific, which was the double hull canoe. And we find that the double hull canoe technology was almost identical to the technology we saw being used in the building of that great boat which was found beside the Cheops pyramid. Here's another sketch by Abel Tasman, the man who discovered Tasman Island off Australia, and you can see the double hull canoe, you can see a fire beneath the sail there, and the sophistication of the craft for fishing. And the navigators in those times, 1642, were amazed at what they saw when they arrived in the Pacific and around the world, at the level of sophistication of the ordinary people. So much, too, did Captain Cook, and we know the story of Captain Cook. And when believing Cook to be the long-awaited god Lono, Hawaiians carry preparatory offerings to his ships across Kulapaku Bay. Now, what's happening here is that they see Captain Cook arrive, and it's just like Cortez with the white people coming, realizing that Montezuma suddenly thinks, here, gosh, who are these chaps? They're all white. Here, the god's coming back. We've got the same story at Hawaii. And of course, Cook is killed by the daggers which have been acquired by the Hawaiians from their English visitors. And that was the end of Captain Cook. So, very disappointed people, thought the gods were coming back, and they weren't. But this leads us into a really exciting subject. What they found, of course, or what we now know from genetic research, is that the Hawaiian island chain is the world's most isolated. The nearest continental landfall is San Francisco, 2,400 miles away. Whatever people, animals and plants arrived in volcanic islands did so by conquering awesome distances. Yet when Captain Cook landed in 1778, Hawaiian cotton, which we now know is a wild hybrid species, with one set of chromosomes from the New World and another from the Old World, was already well established. So this is the same for the Peruvian cotton too. It was a combination of Old World and New World cotton, and that's something the geneticists can prove is another fact of the kind of links and the kind of sophistication in producing a kind of cotton which was really good. So let's lead on to agriculture and look a little bit about agriculture. This is what we now know about the founder crops and where we can trace the origins of agriculture. And this is the best possible science, published in all the magazines, accepted by everybody as genuine, and we find these 10 probable centers of origin of agriculture. Here we are looking at these sites, and if you do an average of all those sites, it takes you very close to Damascus and to the Garden of Eden, which the Sumerians called Karsag, and we're going to go there on this little journey now. But we see this spread of agriculture from the Near East, from the area around Damascus, right the way through into the British Isles. 9,300, just the dates we would expect when the big planets begin to warm up, and then getting to Ireland in about 4,200, and maybe most of Britain by 4,000 BC. Also going in the other direction as well. Here we have the oldest recorded domesticated fig, which was found, I say, near Karsag, because we're going to look at Karsag in a minute, the Garden of Eden site. This ancient carbonized fig, dried for human consumption, discovered 8 miles north of Jericho at Gilgal 1, proved to have been a domesticated mutant, selectively propagated by local people 11,400 years ago. In this variety of fig, known as the parthenocarpic, the fruit develops without insect pollination and is prevented from falling off a tree, allowing it to ripen. This edible fig would not have survived if not for human intervention. Quite different from the wild species. And this is the crucial part of our history. We find all the domesticated crops and animals are quite different genetically from the wild species. Has to be intervention, has to be genetic modification. The same kind of genetic modification which we saw in the fusing of those 2 human chromosomes. This is where the gods, or that little group of people, decided to come to. It was a glacial refuge. And after the Younger Dryas, it was one place, was a glacial refuge for the wild grasses and plants. And this is where they came. And it's between the Lebanon Mountains, which you can see, snow-capped Lebanon Mountains, north Lebanon Mountains, south the anti-Lebanon Mountains, and the little promontory at the bottom there is Mount Hermon. That is Mount Hermon. One of my networkers, Fran Hakin, sent that to me this week, and it's a fabulous picture of the Lebanese mountains and the cloud. We're very close to getting some really solid evidence to the public on the Garden of Eden site. There it is, intermontane basin. It probably was an old lake bed, drained on the right there. The reason for the dark and light patches are satellite images taken at different times of the year. But they show how dry it is when the snow is on the mountains, and when the snows melt, how wet it gets into that valley, with loads of water discharging off the hills, and a tremendous need for a great watercourse to drain all the surplus water away in the spring, and also to bring irrigation to an area like that in the very, very dry summer months, which is crucial for agriculture to have been carried out here at the date of 9,300. Another view, that is actually across the same basin, looking to Kar Uf, which was Eden, the place of Enel's great house, the case of a reservoir and dam in that valley that comes down through that little village, as you can see. And so we have a whole picture rebuilt of what it was like from what are called the Karsag epics, the Sumerian records. And Christian O'Brien was the man who translated those clay tablets and records to give us the story we have today. Cedar trees, the whole area would have been covered in cedar trees at some point. We don't know exactly when, because it may well be that the cedar tree and its offshoots, this is the Lebanon cedar, and the offshoots, the Atlantica glauca, the Atlas cedar, and the Deodar cedar, which we find more in the Indus Valley, they may well have been cultivated as domesticated crops for this purpose of providing perfect building timber and perfect ship timbers as well. And these Lebanon cedars were being exported to Egypt as early as 3,850 BC on the latest research from Hierakonpolis. This is the Ordnance Survey map used by O'Brien with Mount Hermon on the bottom left corner, and this is where we can follow the trail of Enoch, who recorded his visit to meet the great Lord. And Enoch's fantastic story is revealed here, the journey taken by two angels to the top of Mount Hermon and walked down into the garden, and he records everything that he sees, all matching in with the biblical story and, of course, these wonderful Sumerian Karsag epics. That is the great watercourse. You'll see it running from the bottom of the reservoir and then down the valley a bit and then across on the contours to drain all the water to keep that whole of that basin dry. And this is what we read in the Bible. And the Lord God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put a man whom he had formed. And out of the ground made the Lord God to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. And a river, which should read watercourse, and if you go through this you'll see why, all about translation, because rivers used for all the features because it looks like water as a sign and writing, but people hadn't worked out the practicalities. But here we have, and a watercourse went out of Eden to water the garden, and from whence it was parted, and the parting is obviously sluices, and then it became into four heads, which makes far more sense as irrigation channels. And they're all named. The name of the first is Sion, the name of the second river channel, or actual channel, irrigation channel, is Gihon. The name of the third river channel is Hadekal, and that which goeth forth east of Assyria. And this text, clearly, because it mentions the word Assyria, was written 8,000 years after the event. So you can forgive them for a few mistakes in their writing and translations. And the fourth river channel is Euphrates. So any farmer who's got land and irrigates it, he always names his irrigation channels because that's the best way to make sure that somebody doesn't open the wrong sluice at the wrong time. There's another view just to show how level the basin is and how suitable it was for that kind of irrigation. And this is one of Desmond's pictures, a fabulous image showing very clearly how level it all was. This is Steve Gagney, who written a book called The Energetics of Food. He sums up his work as this. Our ancestors left us more than bones, seeds, stone, tools, priestly cults, and ritualistic incantations to exotic gods. They left us examples of extraordinary feats of engineering, architecture, and sustainable methods of agriculture. They left us legends, myths, and sagas. Isn't it about time we heard them out? There they are in their varying forms. I'm going to go through these fairly quickly, but you'll see all the different names. Even Titan is clearly a link to An, the god An. Ab-Karlu means the bright farmers from the enclosure. Elohim, the bright or shining ones. And we're talking here about the biblical story of the archangels, the angels, and the watchers, who were the culture bearers, who took the knowledge around the world, right the way around the world, in quite a short period of time. And here they're holding the sacred basket, which is an act of pollinating plants. This is good old farming interest for people who know a little bit about horticulture and agriculture. And of course, they're called the Anunnaki, or some people call them the Anunnaki. O'Brien preferred to call them the Anunnaki. And this is a wonderful painting by Hergé before the Second World War, produced from all the work that was being done and the excavations financed by the Rockefellers and other rich Americans in the 20s and 30s, which was the age of the great archaeologists of Breasted, Petrie, Perot, etc. Here is the lady of the group, Ninkar-Sag, and her statue here was found at Mari on the Euphrates. And I found recently that Mari was the principal god of the Basque, which is interesting, which ties in the Basque into the story when people have thought they were out on their own in some way. And Professor André Parrot, in the sun helmet on the right, uncovering a statue of Ishtup Lum, who was the governor of Mari in the days of the patriarchs. This was the fantastic city, over 200 craft trades and guilds, one of the perfect city-state systems which worked all the way back to Jericho. Social organization par excellence, no priests and no politicians, that was the secret. Here she is, the baddies got in much later and crucified her. Look, they put a rod and a ring, the symbols of kingship, in both hands, given her a ridiculous hat, which was only for a very senior archangel, drooping wings, crow's feet, owls at her feet too, and there's a goat's bell and a cow bell and a sheep bell around her neck. That's our Earth Mother Goddess, Ninkar-Sag, Defile. Another wonderful relief in the British Museum from Khorshabad of one of the Elohim, and it was the archangels and the angels who were given the wings. That's an angel. The archangels had the more senior hats with more horns on them. This is this lovely story of Utu, which I can't resist. I did tell this in the spring when I did the other story. But Utu was a senior archangel, the sun god, god of justice, holding his emblematic pruning saw, a little version of events. But he was also known as Ugmash and Shamash. This is where shamanism comes from. Damascus is called Esh-Shams, and the whole story of shamanism comes from this extraordinary character, Utu, who was called at a later stage, or given the title of Shamash. And it goes into, of course, Ogimus and Ogma, which takes us right into Britain with the Druids. So the Druidic links are there right the way through from the Garden of Eden to the time when the Romans put them under sentence of death along with the Christians. And here we have this lovely picture. I can't resist showing this. I showed it before. But this is how Utu became a demon at 1000 BC, much later on. So when you say, shoo, shoo, that comes from the demon, Utu, who was the great lawgiver, etc., etc. This is how we've demonized the gods over our history. And of course, what we actually have here is the same character in Santa Cruz in Mexico, because the Indo-European peoples had, as I said, colonized the world from early times. Key figure, top of the Hammurabi Code, and on the top of the Hammurabi Code, you can go and look at it yourself and get the translation, but Thorkil Jakobsen actually says on the top here, these are the edicts of Anu and Enil, or An and Enil. So we have that, and the symbols are the rod and the ring. And back to Peter Watts' work, that is a standard unit of measure, which probably is a ribbon, and the roll measuring tape. And that rod, standard measuring rod, and the roll measuring tape were vital for measuring out the land accurately, because it was a communal ownership of land, and people had to be allocated land fairly. And the king's job was to look after all the people and make sure the system worked. There were councils of kings back in the homelands, at Shirippa, for example. Even the Druids went back and had annual conferences to sort the rights and wrongs of the world out back in the original homelands. These gods were so respected right up to Hadrian's time that this is the Pantheon dome in Rome, constructed with light aggregate concrete on the higher part using pumice, and built by Hadrian's masons in 126 AD to honour the original 9 gods, An, Enlil, and Ninkarsag, who was one of the 7 archangels at Karsag. That knowledge was there. Even Constantine still paid his respect to An as the supreme being. It's now Catholic Church. We've got the shadow in circular form on the floor of that wonderful, wonderful floor, which I don't know whether that floor is laid out in any terms of astronomic, sundial scale, but it would be interesting to have a look and see. But that light comes through the roof. Nobody knows how it's managed to survive the ravages of time, earthquake, everything. Right in the centre, the most important part of Rome. And that's how it looked. They stuck a couple of towers on it. Unfortunately, took them off again later. And remember, we've got the Church of St. Pudenta, which is Caractacus' daughter, in Rome, still standing, which you can visit, to tell you that the British Church was the earliest church on the planet, apart from perhaps the Jerusalem Church, AD 37, according to the top Catholic historians, Cardinal Brunius and Polydore Virgulo. And that church is still there to be visited. And Caractacus was the king at the time of the early Roman invasion. Back to the oldest city in the world, Jericho, great big tell. We can see that excavation, Kathleen Canyon. And then we've looked at the great rock-cut ditch. Now that rock-cut ditch is built probably at the time of Enki, who seemed to be in charge of this area, and that rock-cut ditch was cut through solid rock, as was our great watercourse, we believe. So very interesting links here. It was a wall, but I think that was a wall to prevent floods. The whole structure of the gates, etc., meant that it was flood protection rather than defence, although if valuable things were being stored in there, even in 9000 BC, it would have been necessary to have some kind of organised administration, which there was, and which tablets and tokens, but I've dealt with that in other talks. This is the tower. The stonework in that tower would not disgrace a medieval castle, and this whole archaeological work at Jericho represents the benchmark for dating the Holocene evolution of farming and civilization. A roof of large slabs, not unlike the mortar temples, etc., and this tower would not disgrace, as it says, one of the more grandiose medieval castles. And the labour involved in excavating the ditch out of solid rock must have been tremendous. Göbekli Tepe, similar site, very interesting, because it's a classic case of go dig a pit, cover it with logs, and here we have about 140 roof supports of a standardized design of people clearly protecting themselves from the sky falling, and also doing fantastic art at the same time, at the same very early date as Jericho, maybe even earlier, we don't know, but very, very important site, and on the top of a hill, and this may well have been where the angels and watchers came to do their various jobs that they did as culture bearers. These are very early city-state sites, unexcavated. Tel Nevi men before 8000 BC. This was the second project after Jericho, but it was never properly fulfilled, although they got down to dates of 8 or 9000 BC at the base of this tell. Sabi Abiyad, very important, 7800. Lots of new excavations, the oldest pottery in Syria, if not the world, new stuff. Eridu, the oldest city in Sumer, very sophisticated building, but we go back before Eridu and find even greater sophistication, going right back and linking between Jericho at 9,000 and Sumer here at Eridu at 5,000. But it's all there to be dug and excavated, and we're beginning to find out that we've got so much more to our history which has been covered up. Baalbek, one of the most important cities in the ancient world, with the most amazing structures and monuments, the biggest temple ever built, granite brought from Aswan in Lower Egypt up to the top of these hills, 3,500 feet, and forming these columns. 6 left now. Everybody, I think most people have seen the trilithon and the massive stones, 850-ton stones, perfectly laid. And this was the place where everybody came to pay their respects to the gods in all the Roman Empire, and way before, probably 2000, 3000 BC, to a Canaanite temple on the same site, same platform, would have come simply to pay their respects to the gods and administer justice, etc., etc. Over the hill from Mount Hermon, which we've looked at, we find that domesticated maize pollen was found in a core sample and dated at 7,500 BC, close to where Karsag was, where we say all the crops came from. The experts said it was impossible, and the two great botanists, Bottomar and Zeiss, lost part of their reputation on the back of having said that. The near synchronicity of agriculture. Horticulture and cultural complexity developed in the Americas nearly as early as it did in many parts of the Old World. The problem is not just to account for the beginnings of agriculture, but to account for the fact that so many human populations made this economic transition in so short a time. It was obviously taken to them by the culture bearers, so you can't get away from that argument. This is Christian O'Brien's work, and he and Joy, who almost made it today, he did his work and identified who these people were, having seen the level of sophistication in his own county in Essex and Cambridgeshire with the Loxodrome, and then went on to Bodmin Moor and saw that we had a really fantastic observational and astronomy observatory. This is the line A running from Hatfield Forest to Wandlebury, and both of fundamental importance to what is now called meridian astronomy, a line on the Earth's surface parallel to the meridian. These are the books which started it all off, Megalithic Odyssey about Bodmin Moor and who the master builders were. So in 1973, O'Brien had got all these facts and details sorted out before anybody else and translated a key part of the Karsag epics, very important. That was pre-Sitchin. Bodmin Moor Observatory, this is what we had, 97 ridge-top cairns, but they were all made in such a way that the stone could be taken away and reused. So we don't see what it was like, but we have a pretty good outline. And this work and research and book is very, very important. The standard unit of measurement, which O'Brien also worked on, and it ties in with Peter's figures yesterday. And there was a phenomenal accuracy of what was actually achieved by the ancient surveyors. And it was based on this Riemann measuration rectangle, which is based on pi. And there's a lovely quote here, O day king, son my father, may there be a Cuzco, may the capable one be he who measures. So the creation of Cuzco. So Cuzco, I'm told, is the name for the surveyor or for the person measuring. The mounds and the surveyors, Silbury, Marlborough Mound, and would you believe it, Barbary Castle. And we may see that little mound at the bottom of Barbary Castle, but we've got an isosceles triangle joining those 4 points, a perfect isosceles triangle from those points, and this was the centre point of Tom Brooks's surveying of the whole of southern Britain, based not on right-angled triangles, but on isosceles triangles. And there's Peter's contribution showing the angles of 40 degrees and 50 degrees. And so they were using very, actually basic mathematics, but using a mathematical system which allowed them all kinds of permutations to survey the whole of southern Britain in those early times, about 2,500 BC and before. And this is Tom Brooks's work, which can be obtained from the Mysterious Planet Net website for you to study. And there you have another example, one of the best examples at Clay Hill. You see the big mound on top of Clay Hill. They would have put the mounds up first, and much later they would have become hilltop settlements, or even in the Iron Age, much later fortified camps. But the key point was these surveying markers and mounds where the whole of the British Isles was surveyed accurately. So let's look at Halafi and Potterley, superb ceramics at 5,500. We've got fruit fly chromosomes on the wall at Cuttlehoyuk, which O'Brien identified. Clearly they had microscopes to be able to do that. That came as a bit of a shock to the professor who identified them as fruit fly chromosomes, and he'd never heard any more from him after Christian O'Brien said where he found them. There they are again. That spider on the NASCAR lines has this reproductive organ at the end of its leg, which may be very convenient for a spider, I don't know. But that can only be seen by a microscope, and it's a very small Amazon spider. This is Robert Temple. He found 450 ancient optical artifacts, most of them lenses. Robert Temple again. Thus, we know that magnifying technology was in use in Egypt in 3300 BC. That is from a bog, a peat bog in Denmark, and it's a concave copper mirror, which when it was polished would provide a superb mirror. When you look at these mirrors you buy for your bathrooms and see they're concave and see the magnification effect, you can imagine the effect of a very large, concave, polished copper mirror. Electric light, we've got Norman Lockyer saying, well, how was it that they managed to paint all these wonderful paintings in these caves? Because there's absolutely no signs of any combustion having taken place, no smoke in the recesses. So strikingly evident is this that my friend Mr. Bourland, while we were discussing the matter, Thebes, laughingly suggested the possibility that the electric light was known to the ancient Egyptians. That is a wonderful image of birds very accurately painted in Egypt from one of the earliest buildings, I'm not sure which one, but when they opened up these buildings in the early 20s, Alan Gardner, Sir Alan Gardner as he became, and breasted arranged for Nina Davis, who was the great artist of the time, to reproduce them exactly as they were seen when these buildings were opened, to preserve the colour and quality of the artwork. And that is just one example. And clearly a peak had been reached right about 2900, with the area being colonized by the Sumerians and the elite people who built the pyramids, bringing the high technology into Egypt at that time after they had to leave the Mesopotamian plains. Now, tying that together, we've got the Pharos Lighthouse, which was built by the son of Ptolemy Philadelphus. Ptolemy Philadelphus, his wife, had persuaded him to produce the Septuagint Bible. That's the interesting part of that one. But he organized this incredible lighthouse, which was still functioning in 1115 AD, well over 400 feet high, and it could be seen 100 miles away. And Larry Radker is an American who's done tremendous research on this to show it was the same kind of technology being used in the 1900s, an arc-light technology. And we know they had batteries. And this is the Manna machine. This is a couple of patent engineers who looked at the Zohar and said, hang on a minute, this isn't a god, this is a machine. And there it is, the Manna machine, for producing algae to feed people. And all the technical terms are described wonderfully, and I recommend you look at that book, because on its own people would say that'd be ridiculous. But when it's added into all these other features, much of the ancient texts aren't about gods, they're about high-tech operations. And we know about the Antikythera mechanism, and this is a lovely quote from Professor Edmonds. In terms of historic and scarcity value, I have to regard this mechanism as being more valuable than the Mona Lisa. The astronomy is exactly right. That's about the golden age, which most of you have seen, the blissful and unrivaled state of man in an era of universal peace before he'd learnt to know fear and before the confusion of tongues. Now this is back to Parrott, and Parrott talks about Mesopotamia, and he says, now that we can view the Mesopotamian basin in all its splendor, it is becoming clear that this flame that blazed up so suddenly in the Middle East and shed so wide a light was kindled at several points, each with its own nuisance and of distinctive luster. Susa, Lagesh, Ur, Uruk, Ashurnakak, Ashur, Nineveh, Mari. All alike were centers whose civilization advanced from strength to strength until, thanks to the genius of the few and the boldness of the many, there was wrought forth an alchemist crucible, a prodigious many-sided art. Kramer makes these points that we have the first farmer's almanac, we have all the stories. Sitchin used a great deal of the Kramer material to justify the points he made about Sumer, and of course Kramer was the expert at the time. And of course Sumerian schoolboys were learning Pythagorean theorems 1800 years before Pythagoras, and as Peter saw you yesterday, they were producing their mathematics on clay tablets along the lines that he was explaining. This is important. These are the ceramic cones. They've still got as brighter colours today as they had when they were put in 6,000 years ago, like pegs to surface the mud brick buildings so they were protected from the weather. And the point is that modern paint manufacturers have found that the ancients heated their paints, and this technology is now used today. In other words, by heating the paint, you make the colour of the paint last very much longer. And glazing, we still haven't understood how they managed to work out glazing, because that was such a highly advanced technique, it's beyond belief. And that is of a solid rock wall underneath the Saqqara step pyramid. That is a beautiful trough, and those symbols are the symbols of the Lady Ninkar-Sag, the governor of the Garden of Eden, a wife of Enlil, and the lady biologist who worked with Enki to produce workers. That's another story, but it's a very important fact which Sitchin bases his work on. There's evidence of the clays and the various floods in the Mesopotamian plains, and Noah was in fact a king in Mesopotamia, and that story got very mangled over time. And here is Gary Bilcliffe, one of a network, one of the key researchers, showing us a lovely polygonal tower, and guess where? It's an Etruscan in Italy, and you see the same technology in Brazil. So the technology went from the old world to the new world, and look at that, that's in Greece, Pelagesian city walls, or Titans, there's several names, but look at that polygonal work, and that's even better than you find in most of Peru and Colombia. And that's the Ollantaytambo stone technology. You can see the precision there. We don't know how they did it. Dense, hard, andesite rock was cut. Unbelievable. And that's a pyramid also taken by Gary Bilcliffe, who always finds these fantastic places and objects. And that was in Mexico City. It was actually in the Hapgood book. And they're never really quite sure of the dates, but it was certainly before 3,500. And it may well have been as old as 5,000 BC. And it was a circular pyramid. Panpipes, common right the way across from Greece to Bolivia, Solomon Islands. And that common pitch and toning, by the way, was really does go back to give very clear indications of, if you like, international standardization of music at very early dates, for obviously natural reasons, as we saw from Peter's work. They worked out the tones. That's one of my favourite ones from a marvellous lady called Ruth Farrell. Where did we get that hat? And they're all hats which go from the ancient Egypt before it was unified to Mexico, pixie hats, if you like, and Mithras' cap, all common around the world as early as 3000 BC. Phaistostis, the very early picture writing from which the cuneiform was produced, common in Indus Valley signs there. So you have the same kind of writing amongst the European people very early. So you have exact similarities between the Indus Valley and Easter Island and South America too, and Mexico. A little bit on the South America, you find in Peru exactly the same kind of terraces as you find in Lebanon. You have these extraordinary Lake Titicaca, the story there. All those glyphs, which people have got very excited about, are simply farmers clearing the land for their livestock and making rows of stones. And we saw it on Time Team last week on Exmoor, where it wasn't a processional way, it was where the people actually cleared all the stones to provide good grazing for their cattle and other livestock. Common as well at Lake Titicaca by the same people who colonized Exmoor, colonized Peru. The skulls that were found by Budansky were 3 times the cranial capacity of modern man and are displayed in the La Paz Museum in Bolivia. But I've got a photograph which Bernard Dallaire provided me with of the giant species of Homo sapiens, much larger species, which was said to be common, and there's a lot of evidence. This photograph is one in California, but we did see a much larger species of our species, Homo sapiens. That shows 6 feet, 6-foot layer of waterborne sediment at the altitude of 12,500 feet, which explains a massive movement over 12,000 feet from sea floor up the side of the Andes at this time of the axis shift. And that's Lake Titicaca again. The Inca founding myths are the same as the Hebrew and Sumerian. Those are the kind of structures left lying around, but we've got interesting links here. These are the pre-Columbian aeroplane models, which people have seen, and so they must have known something about flying at those times. They certainly had nice models of them. Those are earplugs, so the thickness of less than a millimetre and completely symmetrical. And what is being said, they could only be machined. That's another farming operation on the Amazon.
The whole of Colombia was farmed. There was more food produced in South America than there is in America today at one point in time in the past. And this is Mexico floating gardens where they use volcanic ash to encourage soil bacteria to break down the human excrement on these gardens. Raised beds and underground shafts to irrigation channels. As the planet dried out in many areas, they were forced to extreme measures to dig deep wells and then join channels so they could take water, even 50 miles in some cases, underground. An extraordinary level of work and ingenuity. Clay and geopolymer molded cup, they used geopolymers, which means a plastic, if you like, made of vegetable acids and other compounds, which when they dried were very, very strong, very, very hard. And of course nobody knew how they drilled the holes in them, but the holes were put in while they were soft. And particularly the Bardarian pottery, which we've got at 5000 BC. Very advanced pottery, very advanced techniques. Again, and that's alabaster, which was a common, softer stone, but a beautiful object from the area of Hierakonpolis in Lower Egypt, 3,850. And the same, that's 3,850 at Hierakonpolis, excavated last year. Beautiful, precision objects. And there, believe it or not, we have the Pythagorean triangle at the same time as Osiris in ancient Egypt. The right one, he's got his appendage sticking up. It's been cut off lower down. And just on the mention of that, there is also loads of evidence of artificial insemination by the pharaohs at these times to have their organized eugenics, if you like, but I believe it was done in a benevolent and sensible way. That's another artifact with a stone embedded with a screw-threaded metal bar and is suspected of being from outer space. These are the kind of extreme things, but they're fun to look at and compare with other things. That's a remnant of ancient technology in Egypt. That is from China, which is superb. Nobody knows how they did that, but they had a machine to cut that precisely. And it's one of the hardest substances of all, which is jade. Fuxi was believed to have lived between 8,000 and 7,000 years ago. He was one of the shining ones who went to China, and we saw all this sophistication in northern China and the Middle Eastern millet and the wheat and barleys in that area at that time. And that is just one of the pictures from Robert Temple's Genius of China, which I recommend everybody to read. There are over 100 major inventions, discoveries, immunization, oil drilling, all kinds of things, which we had to learn from the Chinese. And we have the story from Marco Polo too. But that bridge is 123 foot wide and was built in 610 AD. That is, these two guys, Alan Bond and Mark Hempswell, are currently building the British shuttle, which not many of you know about. We are building a practical, workable shuttle which received a £100 million grant for reaction engines, and they're going to build a fly-off airfields with an engine that will work in the air and also as a rocket in space, and then fly back home again. And this is unbelievable, one of the best things that the British have been able to get their heads around. And that's a planisphere recording the Cophos asteroid, but this obelisk appears to be abandoned after being finished, but it ties in with the Irish round towers, which were paramagnetic and produced a magnetic field in which they grew crops. So you find all those very early Irish settlements were circular, on which the churches were built, but they were gardens where they produced twice the growth rate in their crops by growing the crops in a magnetic field, now being used by plant growers all over the place. A piece of iron found very, very early, 4,000 years ago. Fantastic stonework. Nobody could believe that stonework reached a peak at 3,900 and hasn't been improved upon since. And then we look at Great Zimbabwe. Just look at that stonework. I've just put this in for fun. This is from the Quran, and what we're talking about here is that when they worked this out, they found that what was being talked about, that angels travel at the speed of light. But what's important is not whether or not angels travelled at the speed of light, but they actually had a figure for the speed of light at that time when the Quran was put together. Sophisticated humans. All those artifacts that have survived from the past were made by humans with real artistic ability. The idea that these people lived under primitive conditions is refuted by archaeological facts. Implements made out of iron and steel need to be used in order to shape stone. Societies in the past used such devices to shape stone just as present-day ones do. evolutionists admit there is no evidence to support their claim that human beings and apes are descended from a common ancestor. And asked how this evolution might have come about, they respond totally unscientifically, we do not know, though we hope to one day. Of the out of the most outstanding mysteries about the evolution of humans are, why do we walk on two legs? Why have we lost our fur? Why have they developed such large brains? Why did they learn to speak? The orthodox answers to these questions are, we do not yet know, we do not yet know, we do not yet know, we do not yet know. This list of questions could be considerably lengthened without affecting the monotony of the answers. And it's Elaine Morgan. Thank you.